Hello again, it's Jim Ransom with another session of poetry readings. You'll perhaps recall that last week I warned you I would spend some of my week reading longer poems. That didn't mean I knew I would read some of those today, but of course, that's what happened. Of course, the definition of a long poem is a bit different in today's distracted society. Who can imagine sitting still long enough to read the Canterbury Tales in one sitting, or one of the aptly named Longfellow's poems? Of course, we will sit through a long movie sometimes, won't we? But stuff is happening on the screen, not just words. It's different, isn't it? It is Easter weekend. But as you know, I read some Easter material earlier to get you ready. And besides, if you are in church, you will hear some wonderful poetry from the Psalms and Testaments tomorrow. But I did find a wonderful longer poem by Heather McHugh in the Poetry 180 volume I've been reading from recently. And you'll recall it. Here it is again, Poetry 180, as put together by Billy Collins a few years back. And I found this poem, which I think is quite good, and it needs to be read. Now, Heather McHugh, who is she? She's an academic poet who has taught at the University of Washington and at Berkeley, as well as at the University of North Carolina. However, despite the taint of Berkeley, she is remarkably free from what I call academic obscurity. The poem I'm reading is called What He Thought, and it is dedicated to Fabio Doppler. I suspect that this gentleman is one of the main characters in the poem, and you'll have to decide who he might be. That won't be hard. Here's the poem, What He Thought. We were supposed to do a job in Italy, and full of our feeling for ourselves, our sense of being poets from America, we went from Rome to Fano, met the mayor, mulled a couple of matters over. What's cheap date, they asked. What's flat drink? Among Italian literati, we could recognize our counterparts: the academic, the apologist, the arrogant, the amorous, the brazen, and the glib. And there was one administrator, the conservative, in suit of regulation gray, who, like a good tour guide with measured pace and uninflected tone, narrated sights and histories the hired van hauled us past. Of all, he was most politic and least poetic. So it seemed. Our last few days in Rome, when all but 3 of the New World bards had flown, I found a book of poems this unprepossessing one had written. It was there in the pensione room, a room he'd recommended, where it must have been abandoned by the German visitor. Was there a bus of them? To whom he had inscribed and dated it a month before. I couldn't read Italian either, so I put the book back into the wardrobe's dark. We last Americans were due to leave tomorrow. Our parting evening then, our host chose something in a family restaurant, and there We sat and chatted, sat and chewed, till sensible it was our last big chance to be poetic, make our mark. One of us asked, "What's poetry? Is it the fruits and vegetables and marketplace of Campo di Fiori, or the statue there?" Because I was the glib one, I identified the answer instantly. I didn't have to think. "The truth is both." "It's both," I blurted out. But that was easy. That was easiest to say. What followed taught me something about difficulty, for our underestimated host spoke out. All of a sudden, with a rising passion, and he said, "The statue represents Giordano Bruno, brought to be burned in the public square because of his offense against authority, which is to say, the church. His crime was his belief the universe does not revolve around the human being. God is no fixed point or central government, but rather is poured in waves through all things. All things move. If God is not the soul itself, he is the soul of the world." Such was his heresy. The day they brought him forth to die, they feared he might incite the crowd. The man was famous for his eloquence. And so his captors placed upon his face an iron mask in which he could not speak. That's how they burned him. That is how he died, without a word, in front of everyone. And poetry? We'd all put down our forks by now to listen to the man in gray. He went on softly. Poetry is what he thought, but did not say. Well, that's a pretty potent and moving poem, I thought. And it summed up everything about the visit and about the gentleman who apparently spoke also German as well as English and Italian, of course. And he may have had a German father. His name was Fabio Doppelker. Doppelker is not an Italian name, as far as I would say. But then, I'm not a fluent Italian speaker either. I know enough to ask about items on the menu, and maybe enough to ask where the loo is located, but that's about it. I'm going to turn abruptly, you might say, and fly to the 18th century, where long poems took the place of movies and TV during the long winters in England. One celebrated poet of that era was Alexander Pope, of whom most of you have heard. He was a little fellow who suffered from scoliosis, and at that time that was called hunchback. And he wrote many memorable lines with rhyming couplets. Probably his best-known poem is his Essay on Man. It contains many memorable lines which are still quoted even by those who know not from whence they came. Here are a few samples, and many of you will recognize them. Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man. Two principles in human nature reign: self-love, to urge, and reason, to restrain. And then in another section he says, vice is a monster of so frightful mien as to be hated, needs but to be seen, yet, seen too oft, familiar with her face, we first endure, then pity, then embrace. Years later, I got to reading the 19th century newspaper essayists. I can't remember whether it was part of a class, but of course Mark Twain was one of them. That's how he got his start. But there were others, often writing in dialects of various groups of recent immigrants. How politically correct do you think that would be considered in this boring day and age? Huh? One such writer was one of my favorites. His name was Finley Peter Dunne, and he wrote in Irish dialect for the New York Post. I believe it was that newspaper. Now, see if this writing in Irish dialect doesn't bring back some memories of Alexander Pope. Vice, he says, is a creature of such hideous mien that the more he sees of her, the better he likes her. Where do you think that came from? Well, of course, it came from the previous lines that I read you from Alexander Pope in the 18th century. And in the kind of writing that Finley Peter Dunne was doing, he didn't need to have a footnote or a reference to Alexander Pope. Most of his readers wouldn't have known who Alexander Pope was anyway. So this, I think, is a good example of how good, sweet phrases from poetry of one era move with us into other eras. And there's a whole lot of those from Shakespeare, which we haven't tried to review, but maybe someday we will. We're going to finish with an early 20th century poem from Hilaire Belloc. And I've offered something up from him. I like a little humor, don't you, in poetry? And this is from Cautionary Tales for Children that Hilaire Belloc wrote in the late 19th or early 20th century. I'm not exactly sure when. And it was wonderfully illustrated, this book, by an artist, a cartoonist really of that era called Basil Blackwood. And the poem I'm going to read you is perfect for a section on long poems, because it is the longest poem in this book, and it's, in fact, as you'll see, the author gets tired of it halfway through and divides it into 2 cantos. But here we go with Lord Lundy, who was too freely moved to tears and thereby ruined his political career. Here's Lord Lundy in the arms of his somewhat shocked mother. Lord Lundy, from his earliest years, was far too freely moved to tears. For instance, if his mother said, "Lundy, it's time to go to bed," he bellowed like a little Turk. Or if his father, Lord Dunkirk, here's the father over here, Lord Dunkirk, in his breeks, said "Hi" in a commanding tone. "Hi, Lundy, leave the cat alone." Lord Lundy, letting go its tail, would raise so terrible a wail as moved his grandpapa, the Duke, to utter the severe rebuke, "When I, sir, was a little boy, an animal was not a toy." And here's Lord Dunkirk and Lord Lundy and the cat. His father's elder sister, who was married to a parvenu, and there they are in the wonderful cartoons, confided to her husband, "Drat, the miserable, peevish brat. Why don't they drown the little beast?" Suggestions which, to say the least, are not what we expect to hear from daughters of an English peer. His grandmamma, his mother's mother, who had some dignity or other, the garter, or no matter what, I can't remember, all the lot, said, "Oh, that I were brisk and spry, to give him that for which to cry." An empty wish, alas, for she was blind and nearly 93, and there she is in her glory. The dear old butler thought, "But there, I really neither know nor care for what the dear old butler thought. In my opinion, butlers ought to know their place, and not to play the old retainer night and day. I'm getting tired, and so are you. So let's cut the poem into two." So you see how modern Hilaire Belloc was about having long poems. So here we go with Lord Lundy, second canto. It happened to Lord Lundy then, as happens to so many men, towards the age of 26, they shoved him into politics, in which profession he commanded the income that his rank demanded, in turn as Secretary for India, the colonies, and war. But very soon his friends began to doubt if he were quite the man. Thus, if a member rose to say, and they're talking here about members of Parliament, as members do from day to day, and there's the cartoon of the member rising in Parliament, arising out of that reply, Lord Lundy would begin to cry. A hint at harmless little jobs would shake him with convulsive sobs. While as for revelations, these would simply bring him to his knees and leave him whimpering like a child. It drove his colleagues raving wild. They let him sink from post to post, from 1,500 at the most to 8 and barely 6, and then to be curator of Big Ben. And finally, there came a threat to oust him from the cabinet. The Duke, his aged grandsire, bore the shame till he could bear no more. He rallied his declining powers, summoned the youth to Brackley Towers, and bitterly addressed him thus. And here's the addressing of Lord Lundy. "Sir, you have disappointed us. We had intended you to be the next Prime Minister, but 3. The stocks were sold, the press was squared, the middle class was quite prepared. But as it is, my language fails. Go out and govern New South Wales. The aged patriot groaned, and then he died. And gracious, how Lord Lundy cried. That is a beautiful example of the scathing humor that Hilaire Belloc brought when he was spoofing the upper-class British habits and styles. And the reason he did it was that literature for children in the 19th century was a type of literature that admonished them to be good or else. The drawings in the book by Basil Blackwood are also wonderful, I think. Well, I hope you all eat an Easter feast tomorrow and then get on with your lives. I enjoyed the reading today, and I hope you did too, and I'll see you next week.